There's a moment, often subtle, when a person begins to realize that being seen for who they truly are comes with a cost. Not a dramatic, obvious cost, but a psychological one, felt in strained conversations, in the quiet shift of how others respond, in the tension that enters spaces that once felt neutral. The more perceptive you are, the more you begin to notice that intelligence doesn't just illuminate the world, it also disrupts it. Highly intelligent people come to understand this not through theory, but through experience. They've spoken honestly and been misunderstood. They've offered insight and been met with defensiveness rather than curiosity. They've asked deeper questions and watched as others grew uncomfortable, not because the questions were wrong, but because they touched something people weren't ready to confront. Over time, a pattern emerges. Clarity can feel like a threat in environments that depend on unconsciousness to function smoothly. So what happens is not a loss of intelligence, but an adaptation to reality. The smartest individuals begin to measure the room before they reveal themselves within it. They learn to read emotional climates, to sense when truth will be received and when it will be resisted. And when they sense resistance, they don't push harder. They step back, they soften their language. Sometimes, they say less than they know, or nothing at all. From the outside, this can look like a lack of awareness. It can appear as passivity, or even indifference. But internally, something very deliberate is happening. There is a recognition that not every space is safe for authenticity, and not every audience is capable of engaging with depth without reacting defensively. This isn't about arrogance, it's about discernment. It's about understanding that intelligence is not just the ability to think deeply, but the ability to navigate human dynamics wisely. There's also an emotional intelligence at play here that often goes unnoticed. Truly intelligent people are aware of how their presence can affect others. They recognize that openly displaying their insight can unintentionally create distance, trigger insecurity, or invite competition. And so they make a choice, not to shrink who they are, but to regulate how and when they express it. This is not self-betrayal, it's self-preservation. What's important to understand is that this behavior is not rooted in fear alone. It's rooted in awareness of consequence. When you've seen enough reactions, enough misunderstandings, enough subtle pushback, you stop seeking validation through being seen. You begin to value something else entirely: peace, clarity, and the freedom to think without constantly defending your perspective. And in that shift, something profound happens. Intelligence becomes quieter, more contained, more intentional. It's no longer about being recognized as the smartest person in the room. It's about knowing when it matters to speak, and when it doesn't. It's about choosing environments where your depth is not just tolerated, but understood. Because the truth is, not all recognition is worth having, and not all visibility leads to connection. Sometimes, the wisest thing you can do is to step back, observe, and let the room reveal itself to you, before you reveal yourself to it. There's a common assumption in our culture that intelligence announces itself loudly, that the smartest person in the room is the one speaking the most, explaining the most, asserting the most. But if you observe carefully, you begin to notice something quite different. The people who understand the most are often the ones saying the least. Silence for them is not emptiness, it's not confusion, and it's certainly not a lack of ideas. It's a form of control, a deliberate choice. Because when you truly understand something, whether it's a situation, a person, or a dynamic, you also understand the limits of forcing that understanding onto others. Highly intelligent individuals develop a sensitivity to timing. They recognize that truth, no matter how accurate, can be rejected if it's delivered at the wrong moment or in the wrong way. So instead of rushing to fill every gap in conversation, they hold back. They listen. They observe how people think, how they react, what they avoid. And in doing so, they gather far more information than they would by speaking impulsively. What appears as passivity is often precision. There's also a deeper psychological layer to this. Speaking is, in many ways, a form of exposure. The more you say, the more you reveal, not just about your thoughts, but about your values, your assumptions, even your vulnerabilities. Intelligent people understand this instinctively. They know that once something is said, it can't be taken back, and it can easily be misunderstood, distorted, or used out of context. So they become selective, not silent in a rigid or fearful way, but intentional. They choose words the way a strategist chooses moves, aware that every expression has consequences. And then there's the question of control within social dynamics. Conversations are often less about truth and more about positioning: who is leading, who is reacting, who is seeking validation. When you speak constantly, you place yourself into that dynamic. You become part of the emotional currents of the room. But when you remain quiet, you step outside of it. You observe rather than react. You understand rather than compete. This gives you a kind of leverage, not over others in a manipulative sense, but over yourself. You're not driven by the need to be heard. You're not pulled into unnecessary debates. You retain your energy, your clarity, and your ability to respond rather than react. It's also worth recognizing that not every thought needs to be shared to have value. In fact, some of the most important insights lose their power when they are spoken too quickly or in the wrong context. Intelligent people learn to tolerate the discomfort of holding back, even when they know they could contribute something meaningful, because they understand that being right is not the same as being effective. And so they ask themselves a different question, not, is this true? But, is this useful, here and now? That shift changes everything. Over time, this way of engaging with the world creates a quiet confidence. You no longer feel compelled to prove your intelligence through constant expression. You begin to trust that understanding itself is enough, that you don't need to display it for it to be real. And in that restraint, there is a kind of power that often goes unnoticed. The power to remain centered in chaotic conversations. The power to choose your moments. The power to speak in a way that actually lands, rather than simply fills space. Because ultimately, intelligence is not measured by how much you say. It's revealed in your ability to know when silence speaks louder than words. There's a particular kind of maturity that develops when a person begins to see through the nature of most arguments. On the surface, disagreements appear to be about ideas, facts, or perspectives. But if you look more closely, if you listen not just to what is being said, but to the emotional tone underneath, you start to notice that many arguments are not driven by a genuine search for truth. They are driven by something else entirely: the need to be right, to be validated, to protect one's identity. Highly intelligent individuals come to recognize this pattern, often after years of engaging in debates that lead nowhere. They've presented well, reasoned points, offered evidence, explained their thinking clearly, and still, the conversation doesn't move forward. Not because the logic is flawed, but because the other person is not actually listening in an open way. They're defending a position that feels psychologically necessary to them. And this is where a shift begins to happen. Instead of doubling down, instead of trying harder to convince, the smartest people start to disengage. Not out of defeat, and not out of indifference, but out of clarity. They realize that when a conversation is rooted in ego, no amount of intelligence will resolve it. Because you're no longer speaking to curiosity, you're speaking to resistance. There's a subtle but important distinction here. Walking away from an argument is often perceived as weakness, as if you couldn't defend your point. But in reality, it requires a deeper kind of strength. It requires the ability to tolerate being misunderstood, to let someone else believe they've won, without needing to correct that perception. And that's not easy. For most people, the impulse to prove themselves is almost automatic. It's tied to identity, to self-worth, to the fear of being seen as less capable or less knowledgeable. But highly intelligent individuals begin to loosen that attachment. They start to understand that their value is not determined by the outcome of a conversation or by whether others agree with them. This frees them in a profound way. They no longer feel compelled to enter every debate, to respond to every challenge, to correct every misconception. Instead, they become more selective. They ask themselves whether the conversation has the potential for mutual understanding, or whether it's simply an exchange of defenses. And when it's the latter, they step back. This doesn't mean they stop caring about truth. It means they care about it in a more grounded way. They recognize that truth doesn't need to be forced. It reveals itself over time, often through experience rather than argument. And they trust that process enough to let go of the need to impose their perspective in the moment. There's also an emotional intelligence in this restraint. When you refuse to engage in ego-driven conflict, you're not just protecting your own energy, you're also refusing to escalate tension. You're choosing not to participate in a dynamic that ultimately drains both sides. And over time, this changes how you move through the world. You become less reactive, less entangled in unnecessary conflict. You conserve your mental and emotional resources for conversations that actually matter, conversations where there is openness, where there is a possibility of growth. Because the reality is, not every argument is an opportunity. Some are simply distractions. And the smartest people learn to recognize the difference. They understand that winning an argument is often the fastest way to lose something far more important: your peace, your clarity, your sense of direction. So they let go of the need to win. And in doing so, they gain something far more valuable: the freedom to invest their energy where it can truly make a difference. One of the more subtle abilities that develops with intelligence is the capacity to observe without immediately influencing what is being observed. Most people enter social situations with a kind of invisible pressure to present themselves, to be understood, to be seen in a certain light. But highly intelligent individuals often do something quite different. They step back from that impulse. They allow themselves to blend in. And in doing so, they gain access to something most people miss. When you don't signal your full awareness, when you don't immediately reveal the depth of your thinking, people tend to relax around you. They don't feel evaluated. They don't feel the need to defend their ideas or posture intellectually. The conversation becomes less guarded, more spontaneous. And it's in that unguarded space that people reveal who they actually are, not who they are trying to appear to be. This is not manipulation in the deceptive sense. It's observation rooted in curiosity, a willingness to see people as they are, without forcing the interaction into a performance of intellect. Because the moment you make your intelligence obvious, you change the dynamic. People become more cautious, more selective. They begin to filter themselves through the lens of how they think you will perceive them. But when that pressure is removed, something honest emerges. You start to notice patterns, the way someone speaks when they feel secure versus when they feel challenged, the inconsistencies between what they say and how they act, the subtle cues of discomfort, avoidance, or insecurity that don't show up in structured conversation. These are the details that reveal character, not just opinion. And intelligent people value this kind of information deeply. They understand that knowing facts is one form of intelligence, but understanding people is another, and often a more consequential one. Because most of life is not navigated through abstract ideas, but through relationships, through interactions, through the ability to read a situation accurately and respond appropriately. Blending in allows for that level of perception. It also removes a certain kind of social friction. When you're not trying to stand out, when you're not asserting your intelligence in every interaction, you become easier to be around. People feel less judged, less compared, less diminished. And that creates a different kind of connection, one that is not based on competition but on ease. At the same time, there is a quiet discipline involved in this. Holding back what you know, resisting the urge to correct, or to elevate the conversation requires patience. It requires the ability to tolerate imperfection in dialogue, to let things be said that you might disagree with without immediately stepping in. But this restraint serves a purpose. Because the more you observe, the more you understand the underlying motivations driving people's behavior. And once you understand that, your responses become more precise, more effective. You're no longer reacting to surface level statements, you're responding to deeper patterns. Over time, this way of engaging with the world builds a kind of insight that can't be gained through constant expression. It comes from watching, listening, and allowing reality to unfold without interference. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches you when it actually matters to reveal your depth, and when it doesn't, because not every moment requires your full intelligence to be displayed. Sometimes, the greatest advantage you have is your ability to remain unnoticed long enough to truly see what's in front of you. There's a misconception that intelligence must be visible to be real, that if someone is truly insightful, it will naturally express itself in obvious ways. But when you spend enough time observing people who think deeply, you begin to notice a different pattern. Their intelligence is not performative. It doesn't push itself forward. In fact, it often does the opposite. It withdraws. This is because genuine intelligence is not driven by the need for recognition. It doesn't depend on external validation to confirm its existence. And when that need falls away, so does the impulse to constantly display what one knows. What remains is something quieter, more grounded, and in many ways more powerful. Highly intelligent individuals often develop a kind of internal orientation. Their focus shifts from being understood by others to understanding the world itself. They become more interested in accuracy than approval, more concerned with clarity than impression. And because of that, they don't feel compelled to turn every insight into a statement or every realization into a performance. This quietness can easily be misinterpreted. In a culture that rewards visibility, where confidence is often equated with loudness and certainty, a more reserved presence can be mistaken for a lack of depth. Someone who speaks less, who doesn't assert themselves in every conversation, may be overlooked entirely. But what's being missed is that their silence is not emptiness, it's containment. There is a kind of discipline in holding knowledge without immediately expressing it. It requires patience, restraint, and a tolerance for being underestimated. And for many intelligent people, that becomes a conscious choice. They recognize that once you step into the role of the knowledgeable one, expectations begin to form. You are expected to have answers, to respond quickly, to maintain a certain image. And that can become limiting. So instead, they step outside of that role. They allow themselves to be perceived as simpler than they are, not out of insecurity, but out of freedom. Freedom from the pressure to perform. Freedom from the need to constantly demonstrate their value. And in that space, their thinking becomes more fluid, less constrained by how it will be received. There's also an understanding that not all environments are capable of engaging with depth in a meaningful way. In some settings, complexity is reduced, nuance is overlooked, and thoughtful ideas are either simplified or dismissed. Rather than forcing themselves into those dynamics, intelligent individuals often choose to remain quiet. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they recognize that what they have to say would not be fully heard, and so they conserve it. They wait for moments where their insight can actually land, where it can be engaged with, rather than resisted or misunderstood. This selectivity is not about withholding for the sake of control. It's about respecting the value of their own thinking. Over time, this creates a kind of presence that is subtle but deeply impactful. When they do speak, it carries weight, not because it's loud or forceful, but because it's considered. It's rooted in observation, reflection, and a genuine understanding of context. And perhaps that's the essence of it. True intelligence doesn't need to announce itself to be effective. It doesn't rely on constant expression to prove its worth. It operates quietly, often unnoticed, but always present, shaping perception, guiding decisions, and influencing outcomes in ways that don't require attention. Because in the end, what matters is not how visible your intelligence is, but how deeply it informs the way you see, the way you think, and the way you move through the world. At a certain point in a person's development, something shifts in how they define success. Early on, there's often a strong pull toward recognition, the desire to be seen, to be acknowledged, to have one's intelligence validated by others. It's a natural impulse, shaped by environments where approval is tied to visibility, where being the smart one becomes part of identity. But over time, for those who reflect deeply enough, that pursuit begins to lose its appeal, not because recognition is inherently negative, but because of what it often brings with it. Attention invites expectation. Visibility invites scrutiny, and being consistently perceived as intelligent can quietly turn into a kind of burden, a role that has to be maintained, defended, and constantly demonstrated. What once felt like validation starts to feel like pressure. Highly intelligent individuals begin to notice this. They see how quickly admiration can turn into comparison, how easily respect can shift into subtle competition. They become aware of the tension that arises in relationships when there's an imbalance in perceived intelligence, how it can create distance, insecurity, or even quiet resentment. And so they start to question whether being recognized is actually worth the cost. This is where a deeper form of awareness comes in. They begin to understand that peace, real, sustained, internal peace, is often incompatible with the constant need to prove oneself. Because proving requires engagement and dynamics that are inherently unstable. It ties your sense of self to external reactions, to how others interpret you, to whether or not they agree. And that's a fragile place to stand. So instead, they make a different choice. Not always consciously at first, but gradually, through experience. They begin to downplay their intelligence in certain situations. They choose not to correct every misunderstanding. They allow others to take the lead, to hold their opinions, even when those opinions are flawed. From the outside, this can look like passivity or disengagement. But internally, it's something much more intentional. It's a prioritization of stability over validation, a recognition that not every situation requires your full participation, and not every misunderstanding needs to be resolved. There's also a kind of emotional maturity in this decision. It requires letting go of the need to be fully known by everyone, accepting that some people will never see you clearly, and being at peace with that. That's not resignation, it's clarity. It's understanding that your inner world doesn't lose its value just because it isn't recognized externally. And in that acceptance, something opens up. You gain the freedom to move through the world without constantly managing how you're perceived. You're no longer performing intelligence. You're simply living with it. Quietly, consistently, without needing it to be acknowledged at every turn. This doesn't mean withdrawing completely or never expressing your thoughts. It means becoming selective, choosing environments, conversations, and relationships where your depth can be received without distortion. And outside of those spaces, allowing yourself to remain at ease, without the pressure to prove anything. Because ultimately, the goal is not to be seen as intelligent. The goal is to live in a way that reflects that intelligence, through your decisions, your boundaries, your ability to remain grounded in situations that might otherwise pull you into unnecessary conflict or stress. And when you reach that point, recognition becomes secondary. What matters is that you are no longer negotiating your peace for the sake of being understood. Because in the end, the most powerful form of intelligence is not the one that demands attention. It's the one that quietly chooses peace, even when it has every ability to stand out.